So the high points of the arrest and the initial interrogation. One too many N's in there. How did that happen? In any case, the main thing about this is I think the way in which Jesus responds to the question, they were looking for Jesus. Well, it's me, you could say. But when you say it's me, people don't fall to the ground. And that's what the arresting party does here. So we have a narrative way of recognizing the play that John has already made back there in chapter 8 on this simple verbal expression that now has become a way of expressing the relationship between Jesus and God the Father. There's also a nice little touch here that Jesus tells the arresting party to let the disciples go. In some ways, this is showing in a narrative way what John is saying is taking place theologically by the death of Jesus. Jesus is letting people go from the reign of sin and error. So what's happening here physically as the disciples get dismissed is happening at a more profound level as a result of the action of Jesus and his Father at this moment. No surprise here that things are operating at more than one level. They have done so throughout the gospel. Little detail, Peter cuts off the ear of one of the servants. We get a name for the servant. Is it that the sources of John, the oral tradition or whatever lies behind it, knows the name, or is this something that's created for narrative purpose? Malchus, in any case, it comes from the Hebrew word melech, which is the word for king. And so for those who are sensitive to the etymologies that are at play here, and John is always playing with words, right? It's not insignificant that the ear of a king is cut off, because kingship is going to be part of the whole deal, as we've already indicated. So the next chunk, 18:12 through 27, is another pair of diptychs, if you will. There are 4 scenes here. Jesus brought to Annas, the high priest, that year. Well, we'll have to talk about that. And then we have a scene of Peter in the garden. And then the high priest interrogates Jesus. And he's finally taken to Caiaphas, who is the high priest this year. And at that point, Peter denies Jesus again, and the cock crows, etc. So we can see some traditional stuff here, but also some curious stuff. The relationship between Annas and Caiaphas, the high priest that year, is an interesting one. It's a historical fact that Annas was in the office of high priest for a good long time, and then was succeeded by his son-in-law Caiaphas. And Annas, after his removal from the high priesthood by the Romans, probably continued to play an important role in the leadership of the Jewish people in Jerusalem. So he only appears in this gospel, and he seems to be the one who is interrogating Jesus when it says the high priest is doing so, because Jesus is not brought to the real high priest Caiaphas until the end of that episode. So this is another one of these cases where there's some reminiscence going on, or some factoid from history that's been incorporated here, however it gets here. That is that the relationships among the high priestly establishment were a complex family affair, and the fellow who was the real high priest, Caiaphas, also had someone looking over his shoulder, namely Annas. The story about Peter denying Jesus, of course, is familiar from the synoptics, so it's no great surprise that it's here with many of the same details, Peter warming himself over the fire, etc. Peter, of course, in all of these stories does not come off as the most ideal disciple, and John has had him in his crosshairs for some time, and there'll be one more episode, 2 more episodes actually, where that will be the case before he's finally and definitively rehabilitated in chapter 21. So Jesus is interrogated by the priestly leadership and sent off to the Roman prefect, Pilate. And the scenes with Pilate are an interesting case of a structured balance that's where the structure is defined by interior and exterior spaces. Jesus is outside of the praetorium during some of these and inside talking to Pilate personally in the other balance scenes. And that set of balances probably contributes to the focus on Pilate on the one side as someone who's interrogating Jesus about political matters, and the high priests and the leadership of the Jerusalem elite who are on the outside and resisting Jesus and calling for his death all the way along. In any case, outside the Praetorium in the first episode in 1828 through 32, the narrator tells us that the leaders want to kill Jesus. They say they should be able to kill him, but they can't because the Romans forbid it. We had a conversation about that. Was that in this class or the other class I'm teaching not too long ago? That the Romans did exercise some control over exercise of capital punishment in subject areas, particularly in political affairs. In any case, on the inside, we have this dramatic conversation between Jesus and Pilate in 1833 and following, where the question on the table is Jesus a king? And that is the general political and legal framework that I think we probably have to keep in mind, that Jesus was probably indeed perceived by the Romans as a political threat. Whether or not he was himself, he was once he did his thing in the temple and caused a ruckus, he was no doubt viewed as a troublemaker who probably had aspirations to upset the political apple cart. And then the question is this what his followers expect him to be, a king, Messiah? And Jesus tells us definitively here that his mission was this, to bear witness to the truth. He says to Pilate, you're the one who's using the word king. There may be kingship involved, but the kingship has nothing to do with the way in which the world works, the way in which you work. Whatever kingship I have has to do with stating the truth, a truth that will set one free. And that is an important message that I think that the gospel wants to send. It's not new. Everything that we find here as distinctive elements of the passion narrative echo things that we have heard at some point during the gospel. And so the notion that the truth is liberating, and it's the truth that Jesus came to bring, both of these are combined here in this dialogue with Pilate. Pilate brings Jesus outside again in 1838, and the crowd say, give us Barabbas. The Barabbas story is part of the traditional accounts here. Nothing new. Again, the crowd's on the outside pushing for the death of Jesus, part of the way in which all of these balanced scenes are constructed. On the inside, we have Jesus being now mocked as king. Again, kingship is the leitmotif, if you will, of some of these inside stories. Here, being mocked as king by the Roman soldiers. So the king of the Jews is being scourged. It's not what happens to a king, is it? But it is what happens to this king. And it's precisely this thing that he has embraced, this suffering that will lead to a death that can cause liberation. After the scourging, Pilate brings him outside again and shows him to the people and says, Idu ho anthropos, behold the man. Which, interestingly enough, is precisely the language that was used, at least in the Septuagint version of 1 Kings or 1 Samuel 9:17, where Saul is introduced to the people of Israel as the first king. So there's probably an echo of that here, that John wants the sophisticated reader who knows his Bible stories to hear. But there's another echo that I think John is involved in, and that involves the motif of the Son of Man, which we have talked about on more than one occasion, going back to John 1:51, where the Son of Man is portrayed as, in effect, Jacob's ladder, the one on whom angels will ascend and descend, going down from and up to heaven. Where is that ladder? That ladder is in effect on the cross, and that's how access to heaven is going to be defined. The Son of Man, I think, is evoked here also from Daniel 7, the classic basic text that leads to all the speculation about the Son of Man, where the Son of Man is enthroned in heavenly kingly glory. And as John has told us time and time again, the crucifixion of Jesus is a moment of glorification. And how is it a moment of glorification? Precisely because it's the moment where the divine truth is being revealed. In any case, Pilate has asked the people to behold the man, to see Jesus for who he is. On the narrative level, he's showing people someone who has been tortured and saying, in effect, is this the guy you want to crucify? But he's also saying at the more theological level to all the readers, behold, this is what you should be looking at, and this is what you should be seeing. On the narrative level, then, when Pilate brings Jesus back inside, it seems that he has maybe seen a glimpse of the truth, because he seems to be a little reluctant to go forward with a crucifixion of Jesus, an execution of this fellow as if he were a simple political criminal. And there's this conversation between Jesus and Pilate about where power comes from. And Jesus tells him, you wouldn't have any power at all if it didn't come to you from above. Again, two senses. The political sense, Pilate would have no power, does have no power unless it were given to him by the Roman emperor. And in fact, he's going to be called from office back to Rome within a couple of years of the death of Jesus because of his probably excessive use of force in keeping down Jewish political sentiment. In any case, that's not what Jesus is talking about. He's talking about the power that comes from high above, that makes everything possible, and that will finally lead to the result that his work is designed to achieve. Pilate brings Jesus back out again to Gabbatha. We have another little detail here, probably coming to us from someone who knows some of the details of Jerusalem and its topology and its names. Precisely the same sort of knowledge that was indicated back there in the stories of the pools in chapter 5 and chapter 9. In any case, Jesus is condemned at Gabbatha, and the people all around him on the outside again, where they're pressing for his death, for we have no king but Caesar. So they're saying we are operating on the political level, and that's what counts. Jesus all along through this episode has been saying there's another level, and kingship needs to be understood in a different way. And my kingship needs to be understood in that way. The kingship of one who is giving himself and self-sacrifice for the good of others, thereby revealing the fact that God is love, and he who abides in love abides in God, and God in him.